Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of Forbes Women. Yuan Yang is a distinguished journalist and the author of Private Revolutions, a new book about four women in China who are dreaming of a better future. She is also a recently elected member of the UK Parliament, and she gave her maiden speech on the House of Commons floor earlier this summer. Yuan, thank you so much for joining Forbes for this discussion.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with your book. Private Revolutions offers a really intimate portrait of four women in China who were born in the 1980s and 1990s and who, as I said, are dreaming of a better future. How did you come to write this book, and specifically, how did you choose these subjects?
So I was posted to Beijing as a journalist for the Financial Times in 2016. And that's the first time I lived in China and worked in China properly, really, as an adult. My parents are from China, mainland China, and I was born there. But my parents moved with me to the UK when I was 4 years old. And so, in that intervening time, in the 90s, 2000s, as China was entering the world stage, becoming a really big global economic player, all of the news of those few decades I'd only seen from afar. I hadn't experienced the kind of growth boom myself. But when I got to Beijing as a correspondent in 2016, I started getting to know women of a similar age to me. I'm also a millennial, so women who were born in the 80s and 90s, and eventually decided to write a book centering their stories of their experiences living through the historic transformation that China went through from the 90s onwards as it entered the global market economy. And the reason I really wanted to do it from the point of view of the women is that as an economics journalist, we often tell stories in headlines and in graphs and statistics that are at the country level, at the aggregate level. I really wanted readers outside of China and in the West. Most of my readers are in the UK and US and European countries. I really wanted to convey to them what it felt like to be living through that economic transformation, as much as the kind of analysis and macro level journalism around describing the economy as well.
It is one thing to talk about the macroeconomic trends, but when you see the micro and the lives of these women in choice to go to school or try to become an entrepreneur, it really brings home, I think, a sense of reality. What do you think is the biggest misconception or misunderstanding or something that the West just doesn't see about women's lives in China right now?
I think there's a huge amount of diversity of experience from different kinds of women, and I purposely chose in the book to follow the lives of four women who were born in a range of different social settings, from the kind of middle-class urban family setting right through to the remote mountainous village setting. And they face very different kinds of challenges related to coming of age and growing up as a woman in those different settings. In the villages, for example, there are still the heavy influence of patriarchal rural traditions where having sons is still really important for your status in the village. And so quite a few of the women in my book describe that experience of being seen as lesser when they were growing up in those villages. In the cities, women face different kinds of challenges, barriers to employment. There's a big wage gap, of course, between men and women in China, discrimination over maternity and maternity leave and so on. And that there are different kinds of challenges at each step of the way. So I think the biggest misconception from viewers outside of China is to see China as homogenous and as there being one Chinese experience. And in fact, the diversity of experiences, not just between men and women, but between women from different backgrounds, is really immense.
How did you gain the trust of the women that you featured? Because this book offers some very personal and some painful anecdotes throughout.
Yeah, I mean, I really set out to write a book that would be intimate and that would bring us into the private lives of the women portrayed, to really get inside, their hearts and minds as to what it is like to experience the breakneck transformation of the last few decades. And you pose a really interesting question about trust, because as a journalist, trust is really the most basic and most important currency of what defines, I think, good writing, in order to get into, again, people's lives and really get behind what they're really thinking about their experiences. it might be interesting to note that I didn't set out actually initially just to write about women. I initially considered writing about men as well, and interviewed a number of young men when I was writing the book who were also born in the same period, in that kind of millennial generation. And what I found was actually that a lot of the conversations I had with young women of a similar age to me were just really different in tone and in quality. And one way that I think about this is that if you're alive in China now, you have experienced a really historical transformation of your society. The kinds of social and economic changes that modern China has gone through in the last 4 decades of rapid industrialization and then post-industrialization, in the UK or the US, they would have taken two centuries or more to play out on the economic and social level. So almost everyone in China has got a fascinating and stunning story to tell about their experience of that journey. The question is, who is willing to trust you and who is able to articulate the interior emotional life of that experience, as much as having lived through it, who can actually narrate it and convey it. And I found that it was women who in some ways identified with me and my experiences, who I could establish that deep level of trust with.
That's interesting. Now, you mentioned that when you went to China in 2016 as an adult, it was the first time you had really spent time there as an adult, but you were born in China. You lived with your grandparents for some time before joining your parents in the UK. So I'm wondering, what was the most surprising part of your reporting process? You obviously had the familiarity from being a child, but was there a moment in reporting out this book, writing this book, that you were totally surprised by something unfolding in front of you or something one of your subjects told you?
Yeah, I think a big surprise for me was really getting to grips with the contradictions in China's political system, and the fact that China is a nominally communist country, is ruled by the Communist Party of China, of course, but the actual governance of society and the market is much better described as an authoritarian capitalism, and in a way that's actually much more starkly individualistic than even the US or certainly the UK and European welfare states. And I suppose the way that surprised me was, as a child, I lived with my grandparents, as you mentioned, in a mountainous part of China before I was 4 years old. And I'm very close to my grandparents, would always visit them, whenever we had saved up the money to go to visit them. So, every other school summer holiday, we try and go back to visit them. But adults, and certainly people of my grandparents' generation, who grew up through an extremely repressive and authoritarian time, survived the Cultural Revolution and so on, are careful about what they say about politics, especially around children. There's a perception of, it's risky to talk about political views. You want to, in some ways, protect your family members from that kind of exposure to that, especially if they're children. And so would very rarely engage in those kinds of conversations with my immediate relatives. When I was back in Beijing as an adult, as a journalist for the Financial Times, politics is all around you, because you're reporting on, whether you're reporting on business deals, whether you're reporting on the latest economic policy, it is about politics, it's about power, and it's about the way that the state operates. So I was really thrown into that in a way that I had, of course, not experienced growing up, and it also really laid bare the contradictions in the professed ideology and sometimes the perception of the Chinese government from the West, and the reality of its implementation.
The book hits at the intersection of gender and politics and culture and capitalism, and this is a big question, but as you look at these big issues, how do you think they will evolve in China over the next decade? How will policies towards gender evolve? Do you have any projection or hypothesis?
I mean, this is absolutely the kind of billion-dollar question, if not the million-dollar question. And one of the reasons I think it's so important to understand the lives of young people in China today and young women is because, well, firstly, those are often the perspectives that are less heard in the West, but also because those will be, the decision makers, the business leaders, and in some cases the policy makers of tomorrow, as China develops. I think that there are a lot of contradictions coming to the fore in Chinese social policy right now, in particular in women's experiences of politics in China, and I think this is seen very much in the last few years in the kind of sudden, quite striking turnaround of government policy to try to promote having more children. Of course, from the 80s, there was a very harsh one-child policy, which was abandoned in the 2010s. And the fertility rate has been dropping very quickly in China, as it has actually in many post-industrialized rich economies. The challenge, I think, for Chinese women is now women who live, urban women in particular, feel like the cost of living, the cost of bringing up children is intolerable. That there isn't enough of a split of duties in the household between the husband and the wife, and that for many women, having a second child or even having a first child is not something that's really practical. And that, I think, is a really big disconnect between what the government wants and what ordinary Chinese women want and what families are talking about. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest potential sites of conflict for government policy in the future.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, we've seen that in South Korea. We're having fertility discussions in the U.S. That does feel like that will be one of the primary issues over the next 10 years. Now, I'm wondering, you were the Beijing deputy bureau chief for the Financial Times when you went to Beijing in 2016. How did that role and being an economics reporter inform the way you approached this book and reported this book?
So I started in Beijing as an economics correspondent, and then became the deputy bureau chief a few years after that. And then during
I gave you a promotion. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was much more of a rookie journalist when I first arrived in Beijing. And then during the COVID period, actually, because of the many barriers to press freedoms and access in China, was running the bureau briefly during I would say it was quite a moment of crisis, I would say, for the whole foreign press corps in Beijing during that time. In terms of how that's informed my writing, I think there are two big different perspectives you can bring onto any story. And one, as an economics journalist, is of course the macro level. It's the level of what's moving the markets internationally. It's the level of growth rates and kind of national averages or even regional averages. But what is really difficult to convey when you're telling those kinds of stories, which are also very important because, of course, people make business decisions based on those kinds of figures and stories. What's difficult to convey is actually what's happening at a more interior and human level. And that's the kind of level at which I try to approach writing in this book. The writing style is novelistic, so it's meant to be read in a narrative format, although it's nonfiction. So all the events in it are completely true. I find through the readers of the FT, when I've written more narrative pieces, for example, in our weekend magazine or in our kind of life and art section, that touch on business or economic issues, it's presenting similar insights but told through a different lens. And sometimes I think that can be an interesting way for people to take in information and to process it a bit differently. It's partly why investors and business people visit countries and actually to have those face-to-face conversations. You're getting information, getting learning about a place and a feel for a place in quite a different way to looking at it from a purely macro statistical perspective. And I think both those perspectives are really important for really educating ourselves when we're making decisions, because we are, after all, humans. We respond to other human stories, and I think it's really helpful for people to have an idea of the kinds of people that they're speaking about or holding in mind or affecting when they're making decisions.
Talk about making decisions. As we said at the top of this conversation, you became a member of the UK Parliament earlier this summer. I want to ask, because you had this line in your maiden speech about how you have moved from the pack to the prey, so to speak, moving from journalism to politics. And I have to ask, as a journalist myself, what made you want to make that leap? Do you think it's, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What was the inspiration to go into politics?
I think this ties in with another point that I made in my writing as well, which is that in many ways seeing the authoritarianism and the growing authoritarianism, I would say, in Beijing, because it has changed a lot in the last few years as I was leaving, and coming back to a country where there is a relatively flourishing democracy and protections over the media, protections over freedom of speech. I think that starkness of contrast made me realize how much holding democracy in a country is really quite precious, and maintaining it is a really important task. I think it's, for the last 14 years, for the previous 14 years of Conservative of government in the UK, I do think a lot of social and civic institutions have been eroded. They've been eroded by the austerity policy of the UK, but they've also been eroded by really culturally divisive speech and discourse that's emerged among, I would say, the Conservative Party and the far-right parties in the UK. And unfortunately, the rise of far-right, very divisive rhetoric has been a phenomenon across Europe over the last decade. So I think we have a lot that we need to fight for and to protect, to really make sure that our democracy is a healthy, flourishing and multicultural democracy in the UK. I know that a lot of my friends who remained in the UK throughout the 2010s, who were still here after I left for my posting in Beijing, felt very ground down by UK politics because it had been dismal for quite a long time. And I think coming back from outside back into the UK, instead of feeling that kind of sense of being ground down, I in fact came with a lot more energy because I felt, well, now I finally have the chance to speak about politics freely and openly without fear of retaliation, surveillance, or retribution, which is far from the rights that you can enjoy as a journalist or even as an ordinary citizen in China. And that level of kind of excitement and energy for a new future, and also need to really make a break with the last 14 years of Conservative government. I think those were the two things that drove me to stand.
That's really interesting because you have written, one of my sources of hope for British democracy lies in living through the opposite, the growing authoritarianism of China. So in effect, you basically see the contrast and you see the opportunities in the UK, and you feel compelled to fight for press freedom, fight for democracy, so to speak?
I think so. I think that, one of the sources of hope that I mentioned in that sentence is partly because when I was in Beijing, I did get to know activists in China, women, including some who were written about in my book. One of the, actually two of the women in my book have really put themselves at risk by fighting for the rights of women and the rights of particularly female workers and workers more generally. I think that seeing that kind of bravery and seeing the creativeness and energy still present in a very authoritarian system because of the bravery of individual actors really made me think about how endlessly flexible and adaptive the humans are, and how we're able to find ways out of even what seem to be real dead ends. In the UK, we have so many more tools at our disposal. We don't have to put our lives on the line in the same way that the women that I'm writing about or the activists that I once interviewed in Beijing had to. And it just feels like there is so much that we can do and so much potential for the renewal of our democracy in the UK, for the renewal of our society and economy in the UK. Why don't we seize it?
That's really interesting. Well, as an economics reporter, or maybe as a UK Parliament member, I'm wondering, do you have any take on Jake Sullivan's recent visit to China? And he met with Xi Jinping just within the last 48 hours. It's not quite related to the book, but as you are a politician now and you've watched the country of China from the economic lens, I'm wondering, did anything about that meeting or any recent news regarding U.S.-China relations speak to you?
I'm afraid I'm going to give you a very parochial answer, which is, the first priority now for all of our newly elected MPs is setting up our constituency offices. So I can tell you a lot more about the happenings of Early and Woodley constituency and the area of Reading, which is to the west of London, than I can about international affairs these days. I think it's very, very important that the world's biggest economies and their leaders are speaking and can cooperate where they can, compete where they need to, and also can have challenge where they must on national security and on human rights issues. And I also know that our own Foreign Secretary in the UK is going to go about a review of China-UK relations, much as Germany did earlier over the last few years as well. And I think that will be a much needed review. But really, I mean, the first priority, I think, for all of our newly elected MPs is to get our constituency offices set up and running and to really serve constituents here. So it's a very different kind of level of focus to what I did before my international reporting. But I think it's also very, very important.
Understanding that you are setting up your office, it might be too soon to make a determination, but you've studied economics and gender politics in China. Is there anything you can say about the challenges that face women in the UK or within your constituency that perhaps those of us in the US aren't seeing?
I think there are many commonalities actually between the problems facing women here in the UK, in the US, and even in China's big cities as well. And I think that's part of what I mean when I say China is not a very homogenous society at all. In fact, it spans a range of social problems, from the problems of real remote rural poverty to the problems of kind of big cities with overheated property markets where young people find it difficult to get a foot on the property ladder. I mean, that's an experience we have here in the UK and also in the US as well. I suppose the big challenge, I think, for many women in caring responsibilities in the UK right now, and this is common, I think, in the US and in China, is about the loss of infrastructure over the last 14 years that supported women with caring responsibilities to carry out their duties while also being able to work. So in the UK, that's been about the shrinking of state provision for early childcare and also the lack of investment into our schools. During the pandemic, a lot of women went into part-time work or went from part-time work into unemployment, not because they weren't doing anything, but because they were taking up positions of unpaid care in the home. And so we find in every society, there's a lot of invisible care that's been done. If there is no social or state provision for that healthcare, then it gets pushed often onto the hands of women who then have to really shoulder that burden. That's certainly what's happened in the UK during the pandemic and in China and in the US. And the question now is, how do we support those women in carrying out those such vitally important social roles? And how do we support them to go back to work as well, if that's what's appropriate? And how do we actually start to grow back the infrastructure? That means that it's not solely falling on individual women's shoulders.
We've had almost that exact same conversation with so many sources that we speak to here in the US. It really is remarkable how global the issue of invisible labor and unpaid care has become in current society. You are an MP. I'm wondering, will you ever return to journalism? Will you write another book? What's your, I know you're setting up your office, but what are the next few years like for you? And do you see journalism ever becoming part of that again?
I mean, a lot of MPs write columns and op-eds, and I'm sure that I will continue to write those. I write kind of updates in my columns for the local newspapers here. I think I'll also be planning some op-eds in the future for national or international papers. I think that, it's really important to dedicate the right amount of time to thinking about writing. And of course, most of my time as an MP is focused on serving my constituents, on my work in Early and Woodley constituency, and also my work in Parliament. So unfortunately, writing has been a big passion in my life, and I will still write for myself and for fun in my journal, in my diaries, and in my notebooks, etc. But there'll be a lot less writing from me appearing in the international press over my career, I'm sure.
I think that makes sense. You have a lot of work ahead of you as an MP, but just for some final thoughts on your writing, what is the biggest thing you want people to take away from Private Revolutions?
I would like people to be able to see themselves in the stories that I write about. And the biggest takeaway, I think, for them is to consider what are the common struggles that we face as women across different societies. And I think finding that sense of commonality is also one source of finding answers to our shared problems, whether that's unpaid care or the gender wage gap or any other problems affecting women across the world.
Yuan Yang, thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate hearing about Private Revolutions and also your new work as an MP. We thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you for having me.